In 1897, America was a country learning how to forget people before it ever learned how to know them. It was an age of factories and railroads, of electric lights flickering into existence, of newspapers filled with promises of progress that rarely reached everyone. For black families, especially in the South, progress was a word spoken by others. Life was measured in survival, not dreams. Children were born into roles already written for them, their futures narrowed before they could even speak. It was in this world that Lydia Johnson came into existence, quietly, without ceremony, without any sign that history should pay attention. She was born in a small, overlooked community where names were remembered only within families and faces blended into long days of labor. No doctor paused to study her longer than necessary. No record marked her as unusual. To the outside world, she was simply another black child born at the end of the 19th century. Another life expected to pass unnoticed. Yet from the very beginning, there was something about Lydia that felt unsettling to those closest to her, though none of them had the words to explain why. As an infant, she did not cry the way other babies did. She watched. Her eyes followed movement with an intensity that made her mother uneasy, as if the child were not merely seeing but analyzing. Neighbors whispered that she was too quiet, that something so still could not be normal. But in a time when fear often dressed itself as superstition, people quickly learned to stay silent about such things. Silence was safer. When Lydia began to walk, she did so without hesitation, steady and deliberate, as though she already understood balance before her body caught up. When she spoke her first words, they were not the broken sounds adults expected. They were clear, intentional, spoken as if language itself had been waiting patiently for her. Her mother laughed the first time, thinking it a coincidence. By the second and third time, the laughter faded into confusion. The world around Lydia was harsh and unkind, but she seemed oddly detached from it. While other children played noisily in the dirt, she sat apart, arranging pebbles into patterns no one else recognized. She traced shapes in the dust, staring at them as if they were incomplete thoughts. When asked what she was doing, she often replied with questions of her own, questions that startled adults into silence. Why did shadows change shape? Why did numbers feel different depending on how you grouped them? Why did people say things they didn't mean? No one had answers for her. No one expected her to ask. In 1897, curiosity in a black child was not encouraged, it was corrected. Lydia was told to stop asking, to listen instead, to remember her PL. Ace. She nodded politely, but the questions did not leave her. They stacked inside her mind, connecting to one another in ways even she could not yet explain. It was as if her thoughts moved faster than the world around her, racing ahead, while her body remained trapped in a place that demanded stillness. At night, while others slept, Lydia lay awake listening to the sounds of the house, the creak of wood, the rhythm of breathing, the distant hum of a world that never seemed to rest. She counted those sounds without realizing she was counting, grouped them without being taught how grouping worked. Patterns emerged naturally to her, as obvious as daylight. To Lydia, the world felt like a puzzle that had been scattered carelessly, pieces lying everywhere, waiting for someone to notice how the why fit together. Her family noticed that she remembered things no one had taught her to remember. Conversations whispered behind doors reappeared in her speech days later, repeated with unsettling accuracy. Events she had only witnessed once returned in her memory fully formed, complete with details others had missed. It was not mimicry, it was understanding. She absorbed moments the way dry earth absorbs rain, quickly, completely, without effort. But understanding was dangerous. In a society built on rigid hierarchies, a child who seemed to know too much disrupted the natural order. Adults grew cautious around her. Some avoided her gaze. Others spoke to her slowly, loudly, as if intelligence could be corrected through tone. Lydia responded with politeness, but her eyes betrayed a deeper awe. Airness. She noticed the fear before anyone admitted it existed. School, when she was finally sent, did not bring relief. The classroom was cramped, underfunded, and ruled by repetition. Lessons were designed to be memorized, not questioned. Lydia listened, but she did not simply accept. She saw flaws in explanations, gaps in logic. When she raised her hand, teachers felt challenged rather than rest. Her questions did not fit neatly within the lesson plan, and so they were dismissed. Some accused her of being disruptive. Others suggested she was pretending. Yet even there, among chalk dust and broken desks, Lydia stood apart. She completed work faster than anyone else, not because she rushed, but because she saw solutions instantly. Numbers spoke to her in a language she instinctive. Lee understood. Words unfolded into meanings beneath meanings. While others learned rules, Lydia sensed the structure beneath the rules, the invisible framework holding everything together. Outside the classroom, she was still just a black girl in 1897, expected to work, to obey, to disappear into adulthood without ever being seen. The contrast between who she was inside and who the world demanded. She grew sharper with each passing year. She learned early that revealing too much of herself brought consequences. People reacted poorly to what they could not understand. So Lydia began to hide parts of her mind, folding her brilliance inward like a secret letter never sent. Still, some things could not be hidden. The way she listened, the way she noticed, the way she seemed older than her years, not in weariness, but in clarity. Elders sometimes remarked that speaking to Lydia felt like speaking to someone who already knew how the conversation would end. Children sensed it too, instinctively keeping their distance, unsure why they felt so small around her. No one in 1897 had language for a mind like Lydia's. Intelligence was measured by obedience, by repetition, by conformity. Jenny, us, when acknowledged at all, was reserved for those already permitted to possess it. A black girl from an invisible community did not fit the image, so the world chose the easiest response. It looked away. But invisibility did not make Lydia smaller. It made her sharper. Every dismissal taught her to observe more carefully. Every silenced question trained her to think more deeply. While history moved forward loudly, Lydia moved forward quietly, collecting fragments of understanding that others ignored. She was growing into something the world had no category for, something it would later struggle to name, measure, or explain. By the end of her childhood, those closest to her knew one thing with certainty, even if they could not articulate it. Lydia Johnson was not ordinary. She had been. Born into a time that did not want her brilliance and a society that had no intention of protecting it. And yet, despite everything working against her, her mind continued to unfold, patient, relentless, and far ahead of the century that had brought her into being. In 1897, Lydia Johnson was invisible. But invisibility, as it turned out, was only the beginning of her story. As Lydia grew older, it became impossible to mistake her difference for coincidence. Childhood, which softened and simplified the minds of most around her, seemed only to sharpen hers. While other children learned by repetition, Lydia learned by intuition. She did not wait for instruction to understand how something worked. Understanding arrived first, and explanation followed later, if it came at all. It was as if her mind operated on a frequency slightly ahead of the present, tuned to signals others could not hear. Language came to her not as a tool but as a landscape. Words were not memorized, they were explored. She sensed their weight, their hidden intentions, the way a sentence could mean one thing on the surface and another beneath it. Adults noticed that when Lydia spoke, she chose her words carefully, pausing not from uncertainty but from consideration. She spoke as though she were translating thoughts too large to release all at once. This made people uncomfortable. Children were not supposed to sound like that. Numbers, however, revealed the clearest sign of how her mind refused to behave normally. Arithmetic was taught as rigid steps, rules meant to be followed without question. Lydia saw it differently. To her, numbers were alive, flexible, capable of forming relationships beyond what was written on the page. When given a problem, she often arrived at the correct answer through a path no one recognized. Teachers accused her of skipping work. They demanded she show her steps. Lydia tried, but the steps she took existed only in her head, unfolding simultaneously rather than sequentia. Explaining them felt like trying to describe a dream after waking. This disconnect created tension. Lydia was not failing, but she was not succeeding in the expected way either. She answered questions before they were finished. She corrected teachers gently, instinctively, without arrogance, which somehow made it worse. Correction from a child was an insult to authority, and correction from a black girl was unthinkable. Her intelligence was interpreted not as talent, but as defiance. The more she was told to slow down, the more isolated she became. She learned to sit quietly, to wait until others caught up, to pretend confusion when she felt clarity. But suppression did not change the way her mind worked, it only forced her to turn inward. Lydia began building entire worlds of tea inside herself, testing ideas silently, connecting concepts across subjects she had never formally studied. History blended into mathematics. Patterns in nature mirrored patterns in speech. Everything connected, and Lydia saw those connections with unsettling ease. At home, her family noticed changes they could not explain. Lydia spent hours staring at nothing, lost in thought, fingers tracing invisible shapes in the air. When asked what she was thinking about, she struggled to answer. How could she explain a mind that moved in spirals instead of lines? How could she describe knowing without learning? Sometimes she tried, and the attempt ended in frustration, both hers and theirs. Eventually she stopped trying. School officials debated her in whispers. Some suggested she was merely PR, precocious, and would grow out of it. Others suspected something was wrong with her, that such mental speed must be the sign of imbalance. In an era obsessed with categorizing minds, Lydia resisted classification. She was neither obedient nor rebellious, neither dull nor easily gifted. She existed somewhere in between, defying the limited language adults used to define intelligence when tests were. Introduced, meant to measure aptitude and potential, Lydia's results confused everyone. She scored too high in some areas and inexplicably low in others, not because she lacked understanding, but because the questions themselves felt incomplete to her. She often saw multiple correct answers where only one was allowed. Faced with forced choices, she hesitated, not from ignorance but from honesty. The tests demanded simplicity. Lydia's mind refused it. This refusal came at a cost. Labels began to follow her. Difficult, unfocused, strange. Each label narrowed the space she was allowed to occupy. Expectations dropped. Opportunities closed quietly without confrontation. Lydia sensed this shift even before it was spoken aloud. She learned that intelligence did not protect her. It endangered H. The faster her mind moved, the more carefully she had to hide it. And yet, hiding could not extinguish curiosity. Lydia continued to observe everything. She noticed inconsistencies in stories adults told, the way truth bent depending on who was listening. She noticed how rules changed when certain people entered the room. She noticed the invisible lines society drew and how strictly they were enforced. Her intelligence was no longer just academic, it became social, psychological, deeply human. She understood power before she understood politics, fear before she understood hatred. There were moments, rare, fleeting, when someone glimpsed her brilliance and did not recoil. A visiting teacher once paused after hearing Lydia explain a problem in her own words, eyes widening in surprise. For a brief second, Lydia felt seen. Then the moment passed. The teacher left. The system remained unchanged. Recognition without support meant nothing. As adolescence approached, Lydia's mind accelerated further, racing ahead of her emotional world. She felt deeply but expressed little. Thoughts piled up faster than she could release them. At times the intensity overwhelmed her, leaving her restless and withdrawn. People mistook this for moodiness, for attitude, for something that needed correcting. No one considered that her mind was simply crowded with more than it had space to hold. By now, Lydia understood something essential. Thinking differently was not the same as being valued. She was learning lessons no child should have to learn, that brilliance could be a burden, that understanding Ing could isolate, that knowing too much in the wrong body could make the world hostile. She watched others move through life with ease, unchallenged by thoughts that kept her awake at night. She wondered what it must feel like to exist without constantly questioning reality. Still, her mind refused to slow. It could not. Even when she tried to live smaller, to think less, her thoughts pressed for Ward, demanding attention. She began writing privately, filling pages with ideas she never shared, equations without symbols, observations without conclusions, fragments of insight that felt important but dangerous. Writing became a way to breathe. By the time Lydia reached the edge of adulthood, it was clear that her intelligence was not a phase, not a trick, not something she would outgrow. It was intrinsic, structural, embedded in the way she perceived existence itself. Her mind did not operate within the boundaries society recognized. It leapt, circled, expanded, unconcerned with permission. The tragedy was not that Lydia thought differently. The tragedy was that the world interpreted difference as error. In a more generous time, her mind might have been nurtured, studied, celebrated. In her reality, it was constrained, misunderstood, and quietly resisted. Lydia Johnson was becoming something extraordinary, in a place that only knew how to reward the ordinary. Her mind worked too fast, too deep, too freely for the era that contained her, and as she continued forward, carrying intelligence no one knew how to handle, the distance between Lydia and the world around her grew wide, setting the stage for a confrontation between brilliance and belief that would soon draw the attention of science itself. The attention did not arrive suddenly. It crept in quietly, carried through rumors rather than announcements. Someone mentioned Lydia's name to someone else, who mentioned it again, until her reputation traveled beyond classrooms and kitchens into places where curiosity mixed with authority. By the time she understood she was being watched, decisions had already been made about her. She was no longer just a girl who thought differently. She had become a question that science wanted to answer. The men who first came to see her did not introduce themselves as intruders. They spoke politely with controlled voices and practiced smiles. They called themselves doctors, scholars, men of learning. They said they were interested in her abilities, though none of them could explain exactly what those abilities were. Lydia sensed immediately that they were not there to understand her as a person. They were there to understand her as a phenomenon. She was asked to sit at tables she had never seen before, under lights that felt too bright, in rooms that smelled of ink, paper, and authority. They placed objects in front of her, blocks, shapes, symbols, and watched closely as she interacted with them. Their eyes followed her hands, her pauses, the direction of her gaze. Lydia felt like the room itself was leaning toward her, waiting. The first tests were simple, almost insulting. Basic arithmetic, pattern recognition, memory recall. Lydia completed them easily too. Easily. The men exchanged glances, scribbling notes faster than she could read. But when they pushed further, when they introduced more complex problems designed to trap the mind into predictable routes, something unexpected happened. Lydia did not follow the paths they had prepared. She reached the answers anyway. They asked her how she knew. She struggled to explain, not because she didn't know, but because her knowing did not translate into their language. Her thoughts did not move in straight lines. They overlapped, collapsed, expanded. When she spoke, her explanation sounded fragmented to them, incomplete. To Lydia, they felt whole. The scientists adjusted their approach. They tried new tests, borrowed from emerging theories of intelligence. They measured reaction time, reasoning speed, recall accuracy. Lydia's responses disrupted every expectation. She was fast where she was expected to be slow, cautious where speed was assumed. Sometimes she paused for long moments, staring into nothing, then answered with precision that made their instruments feel obsolete. One doctor whispered that she was guessing. Another suggested intuition. A third argued that intuition itself was measurable if they could find the right scale. Lydia listened quietly as they debated her presence as if she were not there. She learned quickly that being studied meant being spoken about in the third person, even while sitting in the same room. As the sessions continued, frustration replaced curiosity. The men were accustomed to mastery. They were used to systems that responded to their control. Lydia did not respond. She disrupted. When they tried to force her thinking into categories, she slipped through the gaps. When they attempted to map her cognition, the map refused to stay still. One experiment involved presenting her with logical contradictions, puzzles designed to expose confusion. Lydia smiled faintly, not out of arrogance but recognition. She explained that the contradictions only existed if one accepted the premises without question. When she rejected a premise, the contradiction vanished. The room fell silent. The men looked at each other, unsettled. The test had not failed her, she had failed the test. Reports were written. Words like anomalous, unclassifiable, and irregular appeared repeatedly. One researcher noted that Lydia arrived at conclusions with it observable intermediate reasoning. Another wrote that her cognitive processes appeared simultaneous rather than sequential. These observations were meant to describe her, but they also revealed the limits of those observing. As the examinations grew more intense, Lydia began to feel the weight of expectation. Every movement was watched, every hesitation recorded. She was no longer allowed to imply think. She was expected to perform thinking in a way that satisfied those who believed themselves qualified to judge it. The pressure distorted the experience. Sometimes she answered incorrectly on purpose, not out of defiance but exhaustion. Being misunderstood required effort. The scientists noticed the inconsistencies and grew suspicious. They questioned her honesty, her motivation, her mental stability. The possibility that their tools were inadequate was considered last. It was easier to doubt the subject than the system. Lydia felt this shift acutely. What had begun as curiosity now carried an edge of accusation. They began asking questions beyond academics, questions about her emotions, her dreams, her fears. They searched for explanations that could reduce her mind to pathology. Genius was acceptable only if it fit within approved boundaries. Anything beyond that needed correction. Lydia answered carefully, choosing words that revealed little. She had learned that truth, in the wrong hands, could be reshaped into something dangerous. One evening, after a particularly long session, Lydia overheard two men speaking in hushed tones. One said she was remarkable. The OT. Her replied that remarkable did not mean safe. That word lingered with her. Safe. She understood then that this was no longer about understanding intelligence. It was about control. Science at the turn of the century was eager to define the human mind, to categorize it, rank it, and assign it value. Lydia represented a problem because she refused ranking. She exceeded expectations in ways that destabilized existing hierarchies. A black girl with an unmeasurable mind threatened not just theory, but belief. Eventually the session slowed, interest waned. Not because Lydia had been explained, but because she could not be. The men left with notebooks full of observations and no conclusions that satisfied them. There was no headline, no breakthrough. Science does not celebrate what it can know. T-frame. Lydia returned to her life changed. She had seen behind the curtain of authority and found uncertainty. She understood now that intelligence alone did not command respect. Comprehension had to align with power to be accepted. Her mind, vast and unconventional, had confronted science itself, and science had looked away. What lingered was not recognition, but residue, the sense of being X. A mean lingered in her thoughts. She questioned herself in ways she never had before. Was there something wrong with her? Or was the world simply too narrow? The tests had ended, but their impact remained. In trying to measure Lydia Johnson, science had revealed its own limitations. It had encountered a mind that moved beyond instruments, beyond scales, beyond the confidence of those who believed. Knowledge could always be quantified. Lydia had not failed to meet scientific standards. Scientific standards had failed to meet her. And though no formal record would ever celebrate that moment, something irreversible had occurred. A young woman, born invisible in 1897, had stood at the edge of human understanding and watched it hesitate. The world would move on, but Lydia would carry that moment. Forward, a quiet awareness that her brilliance existed in a space science had not yet learned how to enter. After the scientists left, something subtle but irreversible shifted around Lydia. Their presence had legitimized what many already sensed, that she was different. But legitimacy did not bring protection. It brought exposure. People began looking at her, not with curiosity, but with caution. A world already tense with fear of change, Lydia's mind became something to manage, something to contain. Brilliance, when it could not be controlled, turned into a threat. Whispers followed her wherever she went. Adults lowered their voices when she passed. Some avoided her entirely. Others watched her too closely, as if waiting for proof that something was wrong. The same intelligence that confused teachers now unsettled entire rooms. Lydia felt it in the pauses of conversation, in the way laughter softened when she entered, in the sudden formality of people who once spoke freely around her. She tried to adjust. She spoke less. She hid her thoughts behind careful silence. She learned to smile at the right moments, to nod even when she disagreed, to let obvious errors pass without correction. Each compromise felt small, almost harmless, but together they formed a slow erasure of self. Lydia was learning how to shrink without disappearing. Society had rules for people like her, though. They were never written down. A black woman was expected to endure, not to challenge, to labor, not to question, to accept, not to analyze. Lydia violated these expectations simply by existing as she was. Her mind moved independently of permission, and that independence made others uneasy. Intelligence was acceptable only when it reinforced existing hierarchies. Lydia's intelligence ignored them entirely. Rumors hardened into labels: strange, unstable, difficult, words designed to simplify what no one wanted to understand. These labels followed her into opportunities she was never formally denied, but always quietly excluded from. Invitations never came. Doors remained technically open but functionally closed. Lydia understood the message even when it was never spoken aloud. Isolation gray. Heavier as she entered adulthood. Relationships felt strained before they even began. People projected onto her what they feared most: that she would expose their ignorance, question their authority, see through their intentions. Lydia had no desire to humiliate anyone, but her silence itself became a provocation. Silence suggests knowledge, and knowledge suggests power. At times she wondered, revealing less of herself might make life easier. She experimented with pretending not to understand, with lowering her gaze, with speaking in shorter, simpler sentences. The world responded positively to this version of her. People relaxed, conversations flowed. Acceptance, she learned, came at the price of authenticity. It was a painful lesson, but a clear one. Yet even as she tried to live smaller, the world continued to push back. Some people, unable to reconcile her intelligence with their expectations, sought explanations that made her less threatening. They spoke of imbalance, of emotional coldness, of something being off about her. In an era quick to medicalize difference, Lydia's mind became a potential diagnosis rather than a gift. She felt the pressure most intensely in moments when she allowed herself to think freely. Her thoughts raced, intersected, expanded into territories she could explore only alone. These moments were exhilarating and terrifying. Exhilarating because they reminded her who she truly was. Terrifying because she knew how dangerous it could be for others to glimpse that freedom. The fear surrounding her was not just personal, it was cultural. Lydia existed at the intersection of identities that society struggled to tolerate individually, let alone together. She was black, she was a woman, and she was undeniably brilliant. Each trait compounded the discomfort. Together, They made her existence feel like a challenge to the natural order many believed in. There were moments when Lydia considered leaving, disappearing into a place where no one knew her history. But she understood that geography could not change perception. The problem was not where she lived, it was how the world defined worth. Wherever she went, she would still be herself, a mind too sharp for a society built on blunt tools. Loneliness became her constant companion, not the loneliness of being alone, but the deeper loneliness of being unseen while surrounded by people. She longed not for admiration, but for recognition without fear, for conversation without performance, for understanding without consequence. These longings remained unmet. Still, Lydia endured. She found quiet ways to survive, through writing, through observation, through private acts of thought that belonged only to her. She learned to exist in parallel to the world rather than within it. The cost was heavy, but it allowed her to remain intact. What frightened people most was not what Lydia said, but what she represented. She proved that brilliance was not exclusive, that intelligence could emerge where it was least expected, that the stories society told itself about superiority were fragile. Rather than revise those stories, it chose to silence the evidence. Lydia Johnson became a figure people preferred not to think about, not because she had done harm, but because she disrupted comfort. Her brilliance illuminated cracks in the foundation of belief, and those cracks were easier to ignore than to repair. In the end, Lydia did not lose her mind to fear. The world lost its opportunity to learn from it. Her isolation was not the result of arrogance or withdrawal, but of a society unwilling to sit with discomfort long enough to grow. She remained brilliant, not loudly, not publicly, but undeniably. And so Lydia continued forward, carrying a mind that frightened people not because it was dark, but because it shone too clearly on truths they were not ready to face. Time moved forward, as it always does, without waiting for Lydia Johnson. The world changed its clothes, its language, its machines, but it did not change its habits. By the time Lydia reached the later chapters of her life, the silence around her had hardened into something permanent. Not the silence of mystery, but the silence of omission. The kind that settles when a story is never written down, when a life passes without being formally acknowledged, when history decides that remembering is option. Lydia did not disappear suddenly. She faded in the slow, ordinary way many extraordinary people do, through neglect rather than tragedy. There was no headline announcing her absence, no final confrontation, no public reckoning. She simply continued living, thinking, observing, while the world steadily looked past her. What could not be categorized could not be archived. What could not be archived could not be remembered. The institutions that once examined her left behind fragments, notes without conclusions, observations without follow-up, questions that no one bothered to pursue. Over time, even those fragments were buried beneath newer theories, newer names, newer priorities. Science moved on, confident in its progress, unaware of what it had chosen to leave unresolved. Lydia's mind remained an unsolved equation, quietly set aside. She watched as others were celebrated for ideas she had once explored privately, concepts she had sensed long before they became fashionable or acceptable. It was not bitterness that filled her, but a subdued recognition. She understood how history worked. Credit followed visibility, visibility followed permission. She had been granted neither private moments. Lydia sometimes wondered what might have happened if she had been born into a different body, a different color, a different century. The thought did not linger long. Hypotheticals offered no comfort. She had learned early that reality did not reward potential, only compliance, and she had never been built for compliance. As the years passed, those who had once whispered about her brilliance grew older or passed away. Stories dissolved into rumors, then into nothing at all. A name spoken less frequently eventually becomes a name forgotten. Lydia Johnson became exactly what she had been born as in 1897, someone the world did not expect to remember. Yet, Forgetting is never complete. It leaves behind shadows. Lydia's influence survived in ways that could not be traced back to her, in people she once spoke to briefly, whose thinking shifted without them knowing why, in ideas that surfaced elsewhere detached from their origin, in questions that lingered longer than answers. Her brilliance did not vanish, it dispersed. She lived with the awareness that history is not a neutral record, but a selective one. It preserves what aligns with its comfort and discards what challenges its structure. Lydia challenged too much by simply existing. A black woman whose intelligence could not be measured threatened the illusion that genius followed predictable lines. So history did what it often does. It edited her out. Toward the end of her life, Lydia's world had grown quieter, but her mind had not. She still thought deeply, expansively, relentlessly. Thought was the one thing that had never been taken from her. Even as her body aged, her mind remained sharp, alive with connections and insights she no longer tried to share, not because they were unimportant, but because she understood the cost of offering them. There was a strange peace in that withdrawal. Without expectation, without scrutiny, Lydia belonged fully to herself. The world no longer asked her to explain, to justify, to perform intelligence on demand. In obscurity, she found a form of freedom she had never been allowed before. When Lydia Johnson finally passed, it happened without ceremony. No institutions claimed her, no records marked her. Significance. To the official world, she was just another name lost to time. But absence from records does not equal absence from reality. The measure of a life is not found solely in what survives on paper. Lydia's story leaves behind a question that refuses to stay buried. How many minds like hers have been erased, not because they lacked brilliance, but because society lacked courage? How many? Answers to problems we still struggle with were quietly carried to the grave by people the world refused to listen to. Science prides itself on discovery, yet it often discovers only what it is prepared to see. Lydia was not a failure of science, she was evidence of its limits. Her mind existed beyond the instruments of her time, beyond the biases that shaped inquiry, beyond the narrow definition of intelligence that excluded more than they explained. History, too, failed her, not through malice alone, but through indifference. It did not need to destroy Lydia, it only needed to ignore her. Erasure is rarely violent, more often it is administrative, a missing file, an unanswered question, a story never told. And yet telling her story now matters. Not because it can change her fate, because it challenges ours. Lydia Johnson stands as a reminder that brilliance does not always announce itself in ways society recognizes, that genius can exist without recognition, insight without reward, understanding without legacy. Her life urges us to reconsider who we listen to, who we measure, and who we decide is worth remembering. It asks whether progress means advancement alone, or the willingness to look back and admit what we missed. Lydia was not forgotten because she was insignificant. She was forgotten because she was inconvenient. In remembering her, even imperfectly, we confront the uncomfortable truth that the greatest loss is not ignorance, but the refusal to acknowledge knowledge when it appears in unfamiliar form. Lydia Johnson may never appear in textbooks, but her existence exposes a flaw far more enduring than any omission, the belief that intelligence must look a certain way to be real. She lived, she thought, she understood, and even though history chose silence, the echo of her brilliance ends, waiting for a world finally willing to listen.